In the case of nuclear or radiological fallout, people living around potential targets such as military bases and chemical plants may be advised to evacuate.
Hello, Sublation Media viewers. It's I, Douglas Lain, author of the novel Billy Moon, and also the head honcho here at Sublation Media. With me, as always, is Benjamin Studebaker. Ben, you want to introduce yourself?
Hey, it's me, Benjamin Studebaker, the author of 2 books, The Chronic Crisis of American Democracy, The Way is Shut, and Legitimacy in Liberal Democracies.
Great. So this week, we are going to be discussing Iran and the protests that are happening in Iran, and considering the situation. And I'm hoping we can consider it from 3 different points of view. One would be from the point of view of Iranian citizens themselves. That might be the most difficult for us because there's not a lot of information coming out of Iran right now. The internet has been turned off. And the information we are getting is highly vetted by different political factions on the ground in Iran. So we're not getting any kind of pure, clear view of what's happening. The second approach would be to try to understand it from our own American perspective. In other words, does Iran mean for us as Americans and the situation there, the protests there, and how is it being understood by the political class here? And that would include the left, but also, I would say, our right-wing anti-imperialists. And then, of course, the mainstream liberals and mainstream conservatives as well. And then finally, what should we think of the protests in Iran as socialists, if we can try to work that out? Maybe having answered the first 2 questions will help us answer the third. But I'm just going to ask you, obviously, if you're living in Iran right now, it would be a chaotic and stressful and very difficult time, even if it isn't the case that the regime has killed and hung 12 to 20,000 protesters, which is what is being reported by some. Even if it's much more peaceful than that, it's still a very stressful time. But I wonder if you might know, Benjamin, to what degree the average citizen in Iran might find something to be hopeful about in these protests, or what your understanding is of the situation there for these people.
Well, something like this has occurred several times now, where you have large protests. These large protests are put down by force, and some number of thousands of people are killed, with some further number of thousands of people incarcerated. This has happened several times at this point. Each time it happens, the Iranian government claims that it's the United States that's agitating this, that it's coming from outside, that it's not an organic uprising. Nevertheless, despite the fact that this is the track record, every few years, another attempt gets made to go out into the streets and demonstrate against the regime. So there is a certain perseverance, a willingness to try this many times, but each time it happens, it does seem to get put down by force, which suggests that whatever part of society is staging the protests, that part of society is not able to get the sympathy of the military.
Mm-hmm.
The military is remaining loyal to the regime.
Mm-hmm. So, what is the demographic or class character of the soldiers as compared to those who are spearheading these protests? Why is there a disconnect there? And which group is more representative of the population of Iran overall, or can we guess at that?
It becomes difficult to suss that out from outside. Even when you have very large protests that include very large numbers of people, the percentage of the population that is actively demonstrating in the streets will never be terribly high. Even in countries where revolutions are successful, You don't need an incredibly large percentage of the population actively involved for a revolution to be successful. What you need is a certain amount of disruption such that the economy's functioning is really endangered by the activity. And for you to get that and sustain that over time, you need a certain amount of sympathy between the people who are protesting and the people that you potentially have to call upon to disperse them. When that's missing, it gets really difficult to sort out who has the support of the population until after the fact. So if you have a revolution and you change the government over, then after the fact, you might find that lots of people say they're glad that this took place. Now, those people also will be saying this in part because they'll be under a new regime and they might have something to gain from saying that they're glad that it took place. So it becomes very difficult to be absolutely certain about what the balance of opinion is. But one thing that I have observed is that it's become harder to have social revolutions in developing countries over the years. And I think this has a lot to do with a tendency for regimes to really glaze their militaries, to give the people who are serving in the military a lot of funding and a lot of support so that they have a standard of living that's significantly elevated above the bulk of the population. A lot of the stuff to do with the professional class that people talk about in Western countries, the original professional class is the professional army. When you don't have a large, developed, permanent bureaucracy, even in a very antique kind of state, you might still have a permanent standing army. And the people who serve in that permanent standing army are relating to the state, relating to the polity very differently from everybody else. Because as long as that polity continues to exist, they have a standard of living that seems pretty guaranteed. When there's economic trouble, these are the people who are going to be protected from that trouble for the absolute longest. So even if you have a badly damaged economy, like in Venezuela, for instance, it will take a long time before that economic damage will be permitted to really affect the standard of living of the people who are in the military. And because of this, the military guys know that if they overthrow the regime, there's a possibility of conflict, there's a possibility of civil war, there's a possibility of the new government not wanting to maintain the same level of pay or the same level of benefits or the same structure to the military. There's all sorts of uncertainty. But if you continue to support the regime, then you continue to have a relatively stable and predictable form of life. For everybody outside, those incentives are completely different. So these barracks regimes have become increasingly popular and common. And that's how I would classify Iran at this point, and Venezuela too. They've really become barracks regimes.
So it seems to me that the other part of the picture might be that the military, if they were to overthrow the regime, would most likely be the organization that would be capable of governing, at least for a time.
If it can stay united the whole time, right? And then also, if you have to govern directly as the military, now you lose the civilian government that you can potentially blame for things that go wrong. Militaries that are doing really well, where the people in the military are enjoying a good, comfortable standard of living, benefit enormously from the degree to which it's the civilian government that takes all the flack for everything that goes wrong in the country. If the military rules directly, its high standard of living is unlikely to improve because the military is unlikely to have any brilliant ideas about how to transform the economy, right? But politically, it will seem to be responsible for what goes on in a much more direct way. And there's also the possibility of splits. Once you get rid of the government, there's a chance that some people in the military may not agree on who should be in charge or what the economic approach should be. And as soon as there's a possibility of splits, there's a possibility not only that you could lose your high standard of living, but also that you could kill each other and end up dead and have families in disarray. So for the military, staying united and avoiding a split is very critical. And there's limited incentive to care about other kinds of things like the overall wider economy.
Right. Yes, because as you said, even in a very poor situation, the military will be supported and funded because it is for the civilian government a vitally important aspect of their rule to have a functional military, let alone one that can protect that can serve the national defense, but just in both cases, both as a way to maintain power domestically and protect itself from foreign enemies, the military is vitally important. So that's what we've been seeing overall in developing nations, not just in Iran. This is not unique. It's not because they're Persian or something. It has to do with the character of the nation. And do you think that would apply? The thing is, like in the first world, we don't even often reach the point where these kinds of questions are coming up. But if they were, the same basic problem would arise here if there were to be an attempt at a revolutionary change.
Well, our soldiers don't necessarily have a dramatically much higher standard of living than the bulk of the rest of our population. So this particular dynamic would be less extreme here than in a lot of developing countries where there's serious poverty or serious economic precarity for large parts of the population, but the professional army is protected substantially from those things. You can imagine cases where you have, say, mass unemployment in a period like the Great Depression, where the military would be protected from that. And if mass unemployment were to be your basis for trying to deliver change, the army would not be particularly likely to be susceptible to that. And the classic example would be the Bonus Army March in 1932, where the World War I veterans marched on the Capitol to demand early payment of their bonuses. And the active duty troops were ordered to bulldoze their camp and drive them off. And the active duty troops had no problem doing that and were perfectly willing to do it. In that case, there was no bond of solidarity, even though in principle, these are veterans.
Right.
So it takes a lot to get the military to be actively engaged. One of the ways in which you can try to get the military more engaged with what regular people are thinking is by having a conscription draft. But that's become increasingly unpopular. People think it violates their individual freedom and autonomy to be forced into the military. But then what this means is that no one is in the military who doesn't want to be there or who questions the need and importance of the military as an institution. Which means if you're trying to make an argument to the military that it should support your revolution on the basis that the state is intrinsically oppressive or something, you're not going to get very far with that.
Right. Yeah. So that's interesting. So what I'm hearing from you is mostly that the situation in Iran is unlikely to, the protesters are unlikely to create a regime change or make much headway, despite the apparent size of the protests that are being reported.
As long as it remains the case that the military is willing to engage in extraordinarily violent behavior. If the military were to split or were to become uncertain about that, then there would be a question. But we've seen in a lot of these countries that you can have a very bad economic situation that is very difficult for very large numbers of people without the military behaving in that way.
Right. And the military is not likely to be swayed by world opinion or to be embarrassed by its own violence or anything along those lines. It's not although there is a blackout, so it's not like if there is an extraordinary amount of violence going on right now, it's not as though that in and of itself will cause a legitimacy crisis that could lead to a regime change. I mean, because the picture, that a lot of people have in their mind is maybe the Arab Spring, or what happened in Tunisia, right? Where there was plenty of violence against the protesters, and there was absolute abject misery for many, and that led to the regimes losing legitimacy and being unable to maintain their governance. So
in those cases, the military turned on the regime or there was a split in the military, which then led to a prolonged civil war.
Right.
And of course, these armies look at those events and learn lessons from them.
Yeah. What do you think the lesson was from Egypt or Tunisia?
The lesson in Egypt is they had to go through a significant period of instability to end up with a regime that was not that different from the one they originally had. They've worked their way back to having a military dictator as the ruler of the country. They were not able to make a transition to liberal democracy, produce a much richer kind of economy by doing that. When they held elections, they tended to be won by parties that were sympathetic to political Islam. And so the military then responded to that by pushing that government out and reinstalling itself with a different military figure as the head of the new government. In other cases, you had prolonged civil conflict, which impoverished the country and badly damaged its economic base. Libya being the really prominent example of a country that used to be substantially wealthier on a per capita basis and was really devastated by many, many years of war. And then, of course, Syria being the example that might more readily come to people's minds because that war continued for even longer in a way that got press attention because of the role of the Islamic State. So militaries look at that. They don't see any particular Arab Spring case where a country became much richer and much better off by going through this kind of process.
No, it wouldn't be. If you look back on the history of it, it would not encourage you to back revolutionary forces or reform or regime change because
there was a time when there was an image that people had, not that long ago, the color revolution image. Based on the post-Soviet states. But what you notice about the post-Soviet states is having a revolution and bringing in democratic elections is not what determines whether you get rich. It's, do you get into the EU? Do you get into NATO? Do you become a state that is receiving a large amount of Western investment? Which means the position and role of the West is really important going forward for making these things produce a real economic result. And if your revolutionary activity is not about producing a new kind of relationship with the West, then it's not clear what the ultimate payoff is going to be.
Yeah, and that brings us to the question I wanted to address next, which was, what do these Iranian protests mean for the political class in America, including, the probably least consequential group, the left, but overall, what do you see as the aim? If let's say we take it as true that that Israeli forces in the United States are helping to foment these protests and have a hand in supporting them, what is the aim of that support? And is it at all possible that the purpose would be to transform Iran into being an economic partner with Israel and the United States, thereby lifting the Iranian people out of poverty a bit? Anyway, what do you think about that?
Well, I think that there is, of course, a desire on the part of the Western states to have a government in Iran which is friendlier to Western interests, which is not hostile to Israel, and which is tolerable or acceptable for the Arab states, many of whom have been concerned about Iran for a long period of time. Would there be the relevant kind of economic support necessary to make it a big success? The track record on that for states that are not very close to the existing Western power blocks is not very good. The go-to example, what's a country that used to be part of an enemy alliance bloc and then flipped and became much wealthier, would be Poland. But Poland borders Germany. Poland is quite close to the core of the Western alliance system. You can point to a state like South Korea. There are examples of states that, because they have committed themselves to the West, have developed and received a substantial amount of investment over time. But generally, if you are further away, you don't get that same kind of treatment. There would be some level of effort, I'm sure, to increase trade with Iran. Certainly sanctions would be lifted against Iran. But would this cause Iran to develop very quickly? And would it draw a line under the political instability, or would there continue to be political instability after this point? The history of attempts to bring liberal democracy to post-colonial states is not a great history. So,
well, but I mean, I think of Japan
here
after World War II as an example where the industrialization followed along after Western needs during the Cold War. You know, there was a need for an industrial base to develop in Japan for the military of the United States to both receive raw materials and also
military occupation, right?
Right.
That's the other thing. If you want to do this kind of thing in Iran, either you have to have an Iranian military instrument that is prepared to undertake these reforms, or you have to displace the Iranian military instrument and replace it with some kind of occupation. Iran is not an easy or cheap country to occupy because of its geography. Iran's got these Zagros Mountains with its cities nestled in these mountain ranges. And it has difficult to traverse, unpleasant roadways that go through these mountains that you've got to find a way to drive your military equipment through. You don't have, waterways or, a very easy way of bringing things in through air. There was talk in the early 80s about would the Soviet Union, after invading Afghanistan, invade Iran and try to seize control of the Persian Gulf oil. And a lot of American military strategists worried about this a lot. The reason that nothing like that ever really seriously came close to happening is that invading Iran is a much more expensive and difficult proposition than invading a country like Iraq or Afghanistan, just because of the way it's laid out. Could you do it? Yes, but it would be very expensive and it would be difficult to generate and sustain public support for something like that. The tendency for the United States in the last 20 years, learning from Iraq and from Vietnam, is to be willing to supply weapons and supply air support to local populations in countries that have demonstrated a willingness to fight and die for causes. And if a local population doesn't demonstrate a willingness to fight and die, then the weapons and the air support don't tend to show up. Even when the weapons and air support do show up, you often have cases where the country comes apart and where ultimately you don't get liberal democracy.
So, and I am assuming that even the Trump administration knows what you know, doesn't have any plan to occupy Iran, and so I'm having trouble understanding just exactly what the purpose of regime change was, unless it was some sort of chess move on a global chessboard,
if the Iranians could establish a different regime that had support inside Iran and didn't require that much outside help, then there would be a case for thinking that regime would be stable. And for this reason, the administration will entertain small interventions, small in the sense of quick and cheap relative to a full-scale invasion and occupation. So, for instance, in the case of Venezuela, they capture Maduro, and then this creates a potential opportunity for forces in the country to make some sort of move in response to that instability and that moment of open question about what comes next. But it doesn't displace the Venezuelan military instrument or even the Socialist Party in Venezuela with a Western instrument which can govern the country. It doesn't supply that. No. And similarly here, they will look and see, is there some sort of quick, sensitive intervention that could be made that might tip the balance or inspire something or create an opportunity for somebody? But they're not going to want to occupy the country and make the regime dependent on a continuing, very costly, very expensive occupation of a very mountainous country.
Right. So now we're talking about right now kind of the mainstream Washington, D.C. consensus approach to understanding the Iranian protests, which is It's basically you're hedging your bets. You're you're trying to minimize your risk, but maintain power and influence in the region. Um, uh, but what I'm wondering about, actually, someone just threw us $20. So here, Ben, read this one out and see if you can tackle it from Strom.
Yeah, of course. This is
Okay,
another thing to bear in mind.
Let's read it aloud so people who might
The
be listening only.
Balochistan question, about investments in Pakistani Balochistan and worried about a Baloch republic with irredentist designs. One of the many things that comes up in relation to Iran is the fact that this is not a state which is an ethno-state. It's not the case that the overwhelming majority of people who live in Iran are Persians. Rather, Iran is still, to a significant degree, a traditional empire in that it has within its borders many different population groups that are quite different from each other. So there's also some possibility of a breakup of that state into statelets. But I don't think that that's terribly likely, in part because historically, most of these populations are very accustomed to being part of some kind of Persian state. Almost at every point historically, these populations have been part of some sort of Persian state. So I think it would require deliberate effort on the part of the West to create multiple states in Iran, more effort than anybody's likely to see, because it would be quite costly to impose some new border framework in Iran and make that stick for any length of time.
Great. So my question was going to be, what do people who are on the left and the right who are dissidents want to see in Iran? Like I was listening to Mearsheimer and I watched Breaking Points this morning to kind of see what people were saying about the situation. And of course, Mearsheimer was critical of the protests and the protest movement as a Zionist-inspired, U.S. CIA-inspired kind of color revolution regime change effort. And overall, it seemed like there was a hesitancy to support the protests on the left, not because of any kind of calculation about the likelihood of the protests succeeding, but more because of a desire to not support American imperialism. And I would say Mearsheimer and leftist critics have that in common. But what do you think the political aims are for American dissidents around these protests?
I think you have a lot of people who, because of the Iraq War, are keyed up to think that the United States is going to potentially full-scale invade and occupy countries, and who are very concerned about that, knowing that it leads to enormously high costs to the United States and doesn't tend to get results for local populations. But we haven't been seeing a lot of demonstrated willingness on the part of the Trump regime, to do that kind of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
The Trump administration has tended to want to act very quickly and do things that are within the parameters of the War Powers Resolution. So stuff that's quick and quiet and doesn't require congressional funding and support for a long-term operation. I haven't seen any evidence really to suggest a willingness on the part of the Trump administration to commit in a long-term way.
Right. I don't think
like that.
I don't think there is any commitment in the long-term way, but yet, if you listen to Mearsheimer, he's assuming that there's like this 4-step approach, that there's always the playbook, and that Trump is aiming to militarily intervene and topple the Iranian regime at the end of this 4-step process. That's the 4th step. So, and he's warning against doing that. But it doesn't seem likely to me that was Trump's aim, and to the extent that Trump had anything much to do with setting up the protests, I don't think that was a commitment that was made. Maybe if the opportunity arose to easily achieve that regime change, they would have done it. But yeah, anyhow. So what do you make of the critics of these policies and what their commitments might be to lead them to make those kinds of claims?
Well, I think for one, there are a lot of people who, in the absence of any kind of socialist regime, have since 79 tended to regard the Iranian regime as a sign of a possibility of an alternative to capitalism or to liberal democracy. And for people who regard Iran as an alternative, many of these people are not too fussed about what the content of the alternative is, just that it is a regime that seems to be different, which has been able to survive for a period of time. So I think there's some people who have a concern that the demise of the Iranian regime will further close up the imaginarium of what's possible and contribute to more and more of the world becoming basically the same in terms of what kinds of regimes are able to get legitimacy and exist. I think there's also a set of people who are thinking largely in terms of the Israel-Palestine question, who sympathize with the Palestinians and who therefore have become more sympathetic to Iran as a consequence of that.
Do you think Mearsheimer is in that camp, or people who are not left-wing but rather like right-wing realists are becoming more committed or at least more friendly to the current Iranian regime out of a sympathy for the Palestinian cause?
I think that may be a factor. I wouldn't necessarily say in every case or make claims about specific individuals. In the case of Mearsheimer, he wrote The Israel Lobby, a very prominent book about the Israeli-Palestinian question. And then after he wrote that book, his access to a lot of establishment publishing outlets was greatly restricted relative to what it had been before. So he's someone whose life and career has been significantly affected by the stance he took on the Israel-Palestine question. But I wouldn't speculate psychologically about that, and whether and to what degree that affects his reading on Iran. He's also someone who is heavily shaped by the Vietnam War and his critique of the Vietnam War. But he's also someone who has at times been able to say that he thinks that U.S. interventions will be a success. For instance, he's the one who wrote the piece in, I think it was the New York Times, suggesting that the first Gulf War, the first Bush administration's first Gulf War, would be a stunning success, that the war would be over very quickly with minimal cost to the United States. And that prediction turned out to be true. So I wouldn't say that Mearsheimer is someone who is necessarily always opposed to interventions or always assumes that they will fail.
No, I mean,
no, there are other people who do tend to think in that kind of way.
You're right. But, with Mearsheimer as a realist, he is very much pro-intervention when he thinks it will work, right? I mean, he is kind of hawkish on China. And, I guess what I want to point out to people and to keep in mind for myself is that often enough you'll find these dissonants that will go on various podcasts or talk shows or what have you. And as critics of whatever the current foreign policy of the administration might be, but they have an agenda of their own, their own set of policies that they'd like to see enacted, and they might not at all align with the audiences that they're reaching out to as critics.
Mearsheimer's preferred strategy in the Middle East is offshore balancing. It's for the United States to prevent any large state from emerging that could get control over the Persian Gulf region, but to otherwise not be concerned about what particular types of governments are operating in the specific states.
Right. And I would say that doesn't seem so out of step with Trump's approach here either. I mean, he seems to want, hell, even that's not that different from what Obama wanted with the
I
pivot
think
to
that
China.
the administration, both Obama and Trump administrations, have more of an interest in trying to get particular kinds of governments in the Middle East because they're interested in cultivating a particular kind of set of trade relationships. And I think when you start to think in terms of the economy, then the way countries are internally managed becomes more consequential, because if a country is being internally managed in a quite inefficient way, then this means it under contributes to the global economy relative to what it could contribute. And often that kind of thinking played a large role in, say, efforts to colonize the Americas. The argument being that the Amerindian tribes were underutilizing the territory that they controlled,
Mm-hmm.
and that this was disadvantageous for other people in other parts of the world who had a right to benefit from trade, and who therefore had a stake in the way in which that land was being managed and the level of economic output of the territory. Now, that, of course, is a way of thinking that will sound very strange to people who are opposed to foreign intervention, but it played a large role historically in justifying interventions in many contexts. And I think that way of thinking still does substantially apply to Venezuela and Iran. There is this belief that these kinds of regimes are not compatible with efficient economic operation.
Right. Yeah. And that doesn't really play a role in the political philosophy of the realist camp so much, because they don't tend to think in terms of the world economy and efficiency of trade, but rather in terms of power and nation. So that could be conceivably a blind spot for someone like Mearsheimer, in terms of, not just in terms of like what we would want to see in terms, how we would want the United States to behave, but how it is compelled to behave. The explanatory power of the realist philosophy might be wanting in that particular area.
Conversely, when people take it the other direction and try to frame everything in terms of economic performance, then certain geostrategic issues tend to not be visible.
No, yeah, listen, guilty as charged, I'm sure, in the past, right? Okay, so at the moment, what we have are, we have a left that is kind of reflexively just anti-imperialist, and the enemies of my enemies are my friends is sort of ruling the day when it comes to understanding these protests in Iran. And then we have the realist camp, which has its own set of policies. And Mearsheimer is my example. And this is not at all, a complete analysis of the U.S. scene, but this is what I've got in my head. And then we have the kind of muddling through real politics, or the actually existing politics of the United States, and what I think we can expect is that unless something dramatically changes on the ground in Iran, we can expect for the Iranian protests to drop out of the news cycle, for Trump to continue to put pressure on the Iranian regime, maybe using small scale kind of bombing campaigns or other kinds of interventions to put pressure along the way.
In the last week, that was considered, and it sounded like he was interested in attempting something, but ultimately he did not green light what he was entertaining in the previous week, whatever that was. We don't know exactly what it was.
Right. So, in terms of,
says to me that he thinks that these protests are fizzling out and that there's a limit to what he can do to keep them going.
Yeah, that seems likely to me. I mean, his ambivalence about the Shah's kid. Well, I forget the man's name, but the prince that is
Pahlavi.
waiting in the wings. Yeah,
Reza Pahlavi.
Trump did not give him a full-on embrace or indicate that he thought this.
This is one of the symptoms of the limitations of these protests. The fact that the Shah's heir has to be raised as the uniting figure is indicative of a lack of compelling or charismatic alternatives. Now, of course, in Iran, there's a lot of suppression that makes it difficult for something like that to get going. It doesn't necessarily mean that there's support for the regime, the fact that something like that hasn't gotten going.
Right.
But it is one of the things that makes it difficult to convince people in the military, for instance, that there's something stable and peaceful and high growth oriented, just waiting in the wings for them to adopt, that will be able to get legitimacy and keep it. And when you have to raise that old monarchist regime that lots of people in Iran still strongly object to, it seems to indicate that there's a lack of imagination here about what can really be done. And it's going to be hard to sustain a willingness to die on the part of large parts of the population if you don't have a compelling alternative that can provide a continuing source of inspiration. I don't think Pahlavi is it. And I think Trump also doesn't consider Pahlavi to be the man for that job.
Right. So let's talk about this from the perspective of socialists. I mean, the easy move for me would be to take on the kind of pessimism of the Frankfurt School and just kind of try to wash my hands of the whole affair. But what would you say that would be socialist? People were trying to at least think through what socialist politics would require and entail. What should those people think about the Iranian protests and the muck of this moment?
Yeah, so if the question is, could this produce the socialist revolution, the answer would seem to me to be obviously not.
Right.
But of course, there's lots of other things you can talk about that would fall short of something like that. So one of the big questions, I think, that can really help people to sort out what kind of socialists they are is whether they think it helps socialism more for there to be states that exist that are not friendly to the United States, or for there to be an international community with a high level of sociability across borders. Which of these situations is better for socialism at the level of global organizing? And this is, I think, a question that quite sharply polarizes people. There seem to be profoundly different views. And I think a lot of this has to do with this question of whether it's better to operate in something like a Cold War context where there are multiple distinct blocks and you can pick one to support and then one to be against. Or is it better to be in a world that's more integrated than that, which has more social conditions in it and more solidarity potentially across borders?
I mean, look, the way you're describing this,
diminish the differences among the societies for that to take place.
I mean, the way you're describing it seems fairly clear to me that you land in the second camp, wanting more sociability across borders and a more integrated world.
I think we have to get out from under the legacy of imperialism and colonialism, which creates a lot of mistrust between people who live in rich consumer-oriented states and people who live in poorer developing states that engage in a lot of production, drilling, agriculture. Part of the trouble is that these economies are so different from one another that it's quite difficult for there to be solidarity on global issues that cut across these distinctions. And climate change has become another issue on which there are quite sharply different positions. Some states saying that they didn't get their opportunity to industrialize and should be able to do it now, and other states saying that everyone has to desist from this kind of behavior because of the climate crisis coming. And of course, these states are post-industrial. They are the states that already went through an industrial period and don't need to become industrial powerhouses again. So all of these different issues have produced a lot of solidarity problems that have to be worked through for some kind of internationalism to ever get going again. Precisely for that reason, a lot of people have given up on internationalism and have tended to operate from the paradigm that what you need is a set of states that can come together in some kind of BRICS or USSR or Warsaw Pact style bloc and then compete over a long period of time with a West that is framed as being decadent or necessarily going to decline, eventually going to give way. But this is really just an attempt to have the Cold War come back And I don't think just bringing the Cold War back is a path to a different kind of outcome from the one that we in fact saw in the 20th century, apart from the other possibility, which is that it could have ended in a major war.
Right, which would have been, I think, a disaster for all of humanity.
Unless you're a Passadist, which some socialists are. So,
right. Yeah. Well, on my worst days, I'm a Passadist, but most of the time I'm more rational than that. Yeah. So it's okay. So if we accept that we want a more integrated look, I see a danger in your position that that I'm susceptible to, which is why I want to point it out. Which is that then you start to be overly invested in policies that you don't actually support on their as a goods in themselves, but with a sort of a strategic mindset of okay, what will get us closer to creating solidarity amongst the working class internationally, and what are we willing to accept in order to accomplish that? And the problem there is not the lack of virtue or the hit you're going to take as a moral person or your own reputation as you go along, but rather the abandonment of the end goal and the replacement of that goal with the kind of evolutionary approach where we assume that the integration of capitalist states in a world market will itself be socialism, or we simply let go of that socialist aim and aim for other kinds of good outcomes. There was a podcast I used to listen to on the Blogging Heads network with it was Mickey and Bob. Mickey Kaus was this is what happens, by the way, when you're 55. You forget names. You have to like walk around in your brain to try to remember. But Mickey Kaus, he was was a member of the SDS when he was young. But by the time Clinton was elected, he was a big supporter of welfare reform on the basis of some of his left-wing Marxist aims. Trying to create social equality through welfare reform was what he would talk about. So there are ways in which, you can take a part of the picture and get focused on that. So we could get overly focused on integrating the working class without and drop the purpose of that, which is to empower and transform the working class, the self-abolition of the working class. Anyhow, I've rambled enough. Do you understand what how I'm objecting here?
Yeah, I think that some people, because they want to see a greater level of solidarity, become supporters of interventions that are costly, that are unlikely to succeed, and that perpetuate the bad blood and lack of solidarity.
Mm-hmm.
In a sense, imperialism can be described to a significant degree as this.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, imperialism also operates for lots of other kind of geostrategic and economic reasons. But one of the ways in which it happens is that people persuade themselves that they'll be able to accelerate transformations, which will take a long time to happen, longer than a lot of people might like to see.
Mm-hmm.
And not only do they often fail to accelerate those transformations, but they produce continuing bad blood and resentment, which then makes it even harder to generate any kind of solidarity going forward. So while I would like to see a greater level of solidarity, I am sensitive to this idea that that's not something that's obvious or easy or straightforwardly done. There are lots of ways to not just fail to do it, but in trying to do it, to set it back or make it worse. Which is why I have liked to say over the years that on foreign policy, I'm a cautionist. I'm not an anti-imperialist or an imperialist. I'm a cautionist. I want to look at specific situations and what the dynamics in those situations really are before I form a view about what would or wouldn't be good or useful to do in that specific situation.
Right. And one of the difficulties with that, especially around the Iranian protests, is that it's difficult to get a clear view of what's happening, and as we mentioned at the start, which
and this is also a disadvantage we operate at because we are not in the state, so we don't get briefed. We don't have access to the intelligence reports that the state uses to make decisions, and so there are some cases where the intelligence is bad and our skepticism proves justified, but there are also lots of cases, and more in recent years, where we have been behind the ball and have been surprised by events. And it seems likely that if we were being briefed, we would not have been surprised. So we have to be careful about assuming that we know what's going on, but also we can't blindly trust the state to tell us what is going on in any particular place. It makes it really, really difficult to be quite confident or quite sure of a particular stance with regard to foreign policy. But the good news is most of the time, people like us have no influence over what takes place anyway.
That's
so
true.
Even if we aren't totally sure what's going on, it's probably not going to result in our making a mistake.
True. But I think even as people who don't influence, the militaries of the world or the policies of the states, it's worthwhile to note when you are wrong, because if you want to avoid repetitions that inadvertently serve the very forces that you're apparently wanting to critique or overcome.
And that requires being open to the idea that different situations might be different. Some people after the Iraq War just assumed that U.S. intelligence is always wrong and that there's no benefit to having it and that all it can do is mislead you. And anything the Americans tell you, is automatically wrong. And then when the Americans said that the Russians were going to invade Ukraine, people completely disbelieved this and said, that's just the Americans. They're just making that up. Their intelligence is always wrong. They just make up intelligence. And then in that case, it actually went that way. And the Russians did, in fact, invade. And then the assumption was that Kiev would fall within days or a month or two. And that didn't happen either. It turned out that the American military had been able to arm the Ukrainians to such a degree that that didn't happen and still hasn't happened even now. So sometimes, we do learn things if we're open to the idea that we can be wrong and that we don't have some sort of totalizing worldview that simply tells us how to react in every case without having to learn about the particulars.
Right. Well, listen, we've been talking for about 50 minutes here. I feel like we can come to an end on this conversation about the Iranian protests. I wish the protesters the very best, and of course side with them, those of them who are not just CIA stooges or MK Ultra clowns, but the actual people of Iran. I hope that people stay safe, of course, and it sounds like it's been a brutal crackdown in Iran, which we should note, I think. But there's not a lot for the socialists left to do in this moment, and I think the one thing we can do is try to look at the situation and be as clear as possible about it. So you were helpful in that regard today. I'm going to end the stream, and people who'd like to hear us talk for another 50 minutes or so over on Patreon should join us. We're going to be just talking about what is socialism in general, and maybe discovering what our differences are and educating each other. So I look forward to that, and I'll see you over on Patreon. Let me set this. There we go. All right, I'll end the stream now.
In the case of nuclear or radiological fallout, people living around potential targets such as military bases and chemical plants may be advised to evacuate.